June 6, 1944. Gold Beach, Normandy. Harvey Smith, 18 years old, stood on the deck of a landing ship. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from excitement. 2 weeks ago, the British Army told him he was too young to die for his country. You had to be 19 to serve abroad. Harvey spent those weeks brooding in Felixstowe with the old soldiers, watching others prepare for the invasion. Then Parliament changed the law. Overnight, 18 became old enough. The adjutant sent word, "Join your unit immediately." Harvey was very pleased. Finally, his war could begin. He had no idea what war actually meant. Around midnight on June the 5th, his landing ship edged across the channel. The sea was rough. Men vomited over the rails. Harvey kept his eyes forward, searching the darkness for France. Just before first light, they passed one of Britain's largest battleships. Then it fired. 16-inch guns erupted in a broadside that lit up the sky. The recoil pushed the massive ship sideways through the water. Harvey felt the concussion in his chest. Our war was on. That's what he thought. That's what he'd been taught to think. The propaganda posters, the newsreels, the recruitment officers, they'd all promised glory, adventure, a chance to prove yourself a man. Reality had other plans. But before we dive deeper into Harvey's story, one that will take us from this beach to a place in Germany that will shatter everything you think about World War II, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. This is a story that needs to be remembered. Rocket launchers appeared through the dawn mist. Harvey had never seen anything like them. The shoreline emerged in the distance, obscured by smoke and explosions. Everyone forgot about being sick. Their landing ship approached the beach. Harvey could see AVREs, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, already pushing inland toward Vers-sur-Mer. Flail tanks cleared mines ahead of them. The specialized equipment was working. Then their ship stopped. The American captain refused to go closer. Heated arguments erupted between him and the British commanding officer. Eventually a compromise. They'd land from a raft instead of driving straight onto the beach. Harvey tried to make sense of the chaos through his crackling headset. He was assigned to 2 radio sets on the commanding officer's vehicle, traveling separately from the main assault vehicles. He caught fragments, explosions, shouted orders. Not enough to understand what was actually happening. They landed on Gold Beach behind schedule. Most of their AVREs were already off the beach, heading inland. Harvey would later realize they were lucky. They owed their lives to the specialized tanks that went first. The flails, the AVREs with their fascines and bridges, the ones that hit the mines, the ones that drew the fire. Major Elphinstone commanded all 3 lanes of the assault. He coordinated the advance from his tank turret, directing the specialized armor through the beach defenses. He opened his hatch to deal with a problem. A German sniper fired. 1 shot. Major Elphinstone died instantly. First casualty. Harvey had been in France for approximately 90 minutes. The propaganda posters hadn't mentioned this part. They'd shown heroic soldiers charging forward, rifles raised, determination on their faces. They hadn't shown random death from an invisible enemy. They hadn't shown the arithmetic: open a hatch, catch a bullet, stop existing. The unit made its way to the rendezvous point, an orchard south of Vers-sur-Mer. Harvey tried to process what he'd just witnessed. An officer asked him to inspect a nearby monastery the Germans had used as barracks. Inside, the mess hall still had Hitler's portrait on every wall. Tables were littered with half-eaten food as if everyone had vanished mid-meal. The scene was eerily ordinary. In the entrance hall, Harvey saw a body. He moved to turn it over, to identify it. "Don't touch that!" The officer's voice cut through the air. Harvey's hand stopped inches from the corpse. "It's probably booby-trapped." Harvey stepped back. His first instinct, a basic human impulse to identify the dead, had almost killed him. The Germans knew that instinct. They weaponized it. War wasn't just about fighting enemies you could see. It was about invisible tripwires, hidden explosives, death lurking in the most ordinary gestures. That night, Harvey slept under the stars for the first time in France. Or tried to. The AVRE he was assigned to already had a 5-man crew plus a demolition NCO. 6 men couldn't fit under a Churchill tank. Harvey found a piece of canvas from the ship and rigged a hammock with 2 pieces of rope, one end tied to the tank's towing eye, the other to a convenient fence. In the morning, the crew thought it would be funny to start the engine. The tank lurched forward. Harvey jumped out as his hammock tore from the fence. The crew laughed. War's other face. Not the grand tragedy of Major Elphinstone's death, but the petty cruelties of exhausted men finding humour in others' discomfort. Eventually, Harvey got his rightful place inside the tank. The demolition NCO was reassigned. These demolition specialists had the most dangerous job in the unit. They managed the special explosives carried in the AVRE's panniers, massive charges designed to destroy bunkers and fortifications. This was why, when an AVRE brewed up, caught fire and exploded, the heavy armoured side plates were completely blown off. The explosion didn't come from the fuel or ammunition alone. It came from the demolition charges they carried everywhere. Every AVRE crew drove around with enough explosive power to vaporize their own tank. Harvey was 18 years old. 2 weeks ago, he was too young for this. Now he sat inside a mobile bomb, heading deeper into France, having watched his commanding officer die from a single bullet and nearly triggered a booby trap by trying to show basic human decency to a corpse. This was day 1. The propaganda called it liberation. The newsreels would show smiling French civilians throwing flowers. And that did happen. Bayeux was captured intact within days, and locals did celebrate. But between the propaganda image and the reality lived 1,000 small horrors no one had prepared Harvey for. The ones that don't make the history books. The ones that stay inside you. The ones that, 47 years later, you still remember in exact detail. And Harvey's war was just beginning. 3 weeks passed. Bayeux fell intact. French locals cheered in the streets. Allied soldiers smiled for cameras. For a brief moment, it felt like the propaganda had promised. Then came the bocage. Normandy's hedgerows turned every field into a maze of death. Ancient earthen walls, thick with vegetation, divided the landscape into countless tiny fortresses. You could only see as far as the next hedge, maybe 30 yards on a good day. In the narrow lanes, you could only see to the next bend. Beyond that, nothing. German soldiers could be 10 feet away. A Panzerfaust team. A sniper. A machine gun nest. You'd never know until someone started shooting. The Churchill tanks, designed for open warfare, became claustrophobic metal coffins in the bocage. Harvey sat inside his AVRE, blind to everything except the radio chatter in his crackling headset. At night it got worse. German self-propelled guns stalked the hedgerows in the darkness. Mobile artillery on tank chassis, fast, quiet, deadly. You'd hear the engine sound in the distance, a low rumble moving through the fields. You wouldn't see the gun. Then the explosion. Villages like Tilly-sur-Seulles and Hotot became nightly battlegrounds. The fighting followed a pattern: advance during the day, hold during the night, count casualties in the morning. Harvey learned that war wasn't one big battle, it was 1,000 small ones, each one trying to kill you. But there were strange pauses, days when 79th Armoured Division stood down, waiting for assignment. Days when the war stopped trying to murder you and became almost ordinary. One morning, a squadron of Boston bombers flew overhead. Harvey watched them disappear into the distance. heard the explosions half a mile away. The Germans were that close. That same day, a Focke-Wulf fighter screamed low over their orchard. Harvey and another soldier grabbed a Bren gun and fired at it. Bullets traced into the sky, useless. An experienced NCO shouted them down immediately. He knew what they didn't. Firing at aircraft only reveals your position. The next pass, the fighter comes back with bombs, the folly of young soldiers. But the local French farmer didn't care about tactical mistakes. He crossed the field with a medicine bottle filled with Calvados, the fiercest apple brandy Harvey ever tasted. It burned going down. For a moment, the war felt distant. These were the contradictions: terror and boredom, danger and kindness, death and Calvados, all mixed together in ways that made no sense. Late June became early July. Hitler finally allowed Rommel to bring up the panzer divisions. Everyone knew what that meant. The real battle was coming. The showdown for northern France. Falaise. They moved during the night to a forward assembly point, still bocage country, still couldn't see past the hedges. The next morning, a truck arrived from 6th Assault Regiment headquarters. Staff officers who didn't need to be there, soldiers who should have stayed back. But they came anyway, because humans do stupid things in war. Harvey's crew brewed tea. He took a mug and walked toward his tank. He remembers the sound. A whistle. Then nothing. The mortar bomb landed directly on the spot where the headquarters truck had parked. Harvey was blown several yards through the air. His body hit the ground. When he regained consciousness, he saw a hole near his groin. Blood. He reached for his field dressing, trying to apply it with shaking hands. His crew appeared, faces looking down at him, voices he couldn't quite hear. Then darkness again. He woke up in a medical half-track. 3 young Germans were with him, enemy soldiers, wounded like him. 2 were already dead. The third stared at nothing. Harvey was 18. They looked younger. The half-track bounced over rough terrain. Every jolt sent pain through Harvey's body. He faded in and out of consciousness, watching the dead Germans' heads roll with each bump. They took him to an advanced medical post, a farm outhouse converted into an operating room. A young doctor wearing a carpenter's apron covered in blood asked Harvey to get up onto an old trestle table. Harvey couldn't. His legs wouldn't work. The doctor put him back on the stretcher without a word. They transported him to a field hospital near Bayeux. 2 of Harvey's comrades visited the next morning with news. He was going back to Britain. Blighty, they called it. Home, safety, lucky. They loaded him onto a DC-2 transport plane with dozens of other wounded. The plane had no insulation. On the ground in summer heat, it must have been 90 degrees inside. Once airborne, it was freezing. Harvey shivered through the flight, drifting between fever and cold. They landed at an Oxfordshire base. He spent several hours on a stretcher in a corridor, just one more wounded soldier in an endless line. Eventually they operated. They didn't tell him that they couldn't reach the shrapnel. Days later, they transferred him to Dudley Hospital, a ward full of casualties from France, men with missing limbs, men with burns, men who screamed at night. They operated on Harvey again. Again, they didn't mention they couldn't extract the metal fragment. He recovered slowly. They sent him to a recuperation facility on the banks of the Severn, near the Wrekin. It was briefly idyllic. Quiet countryside, no explosions, no death. Then orders came. Transit camp in Storrington, Sussex. He was going back to France. Within days, Harvey boarded an LVT landing craft that deposited him on the old quay at Boulogne. September 1944, 3 months since D-Day. Lucky me, he thought. They told him he'd be joining his unit near Antwerp. He climbed into a 30-hundredweight truck. They drove through the Escole tunnel, partially bombed, barely passable. When they emerged on the other side, the first person Harvey saw was the regimental sergeant major. "Get back on the truck. the RSM said. "We're going back through the tunnel." The advance was reversed. They'd pushed too far, too fast. Now they were retreating. This was Harvey's grand return to war. Immediate retreat, back through a bombed tunnel, still carrying German shrapnel in his body that 3 surgeons couldn't remove. The propaganda posters showed triumphant soldiers marching forward, liberating Europe. They didn't show this. The confusion, the miscommunication, the advances that became retreats overnight, the wounds that never properly healed, the shrapnel that would stay inside Harvey's body, not for weeks or months, for 47 years. Some wars end on paper, others stay inside you forever. 2 days later, they went back through the tunnel. The advance resumed. 82 Squadron pushed toward Holland. Harvey's unit moved west of the Scheldt River, taking over from Canadian forces. The mission? Capture Walcheren Island, a heavily defended piece of land at the mouth of the Scheldt. German forces had flooded large sections deliberately. The terrain became part of the weapon. Harvey's unit operated from Bergen-Belsen, a small town on the coast. They dealt with resistance in the streets, house-to-house fighting that felt nothing like the open beaches of Normandy. When the town fell, the owner of a cigar factory brought them cigars, a small gesture of gratitude. Harvey smoked one, watching the buffaloes, amphibious troop carriers, churning through the flooded landscape toward Walcheren. These vehicles saved the operation. Without them, the assault would have been impossible. The Canadians called the buffaloes swimming coffins. They used them anyway, because the alternative was drowning in the flooded polders. But what Harvey remembers most from this period isn't the fighting, it's the weather. November 1944 arrived cold and wet. The flatland around Bergen-Belsen turned into freezing mud. They occupied hollowed-out haystacks for shelter, crude holes carved into rotting hay. The rats came with the accommodation. At night, you'd hear them moving through the hay, feel them sometimes, running across your legs in the darkness. You learned to sleep anyway, because exhaustion beats revulsion. Then the snow came. Harvey felt his feet going numb inside his boots. He kept marching, kept working, kept pretending everything was fine until he couldn't walk anymore. Trench foot, his boots had frozen to his feet. The medics had to cut them off. Leather and sock and partially frozen flesh, all mixed together. For a week, Harvey couldn't stand. This was war in winter, not glorious battles, but losing a fight against your own boots. Around this time, they finally received their first delivery of proper winter clothing, tank suits, insulated and waterproof. Harvey put his on in Bergen-Belsen. He didn't take it off until Nijmegen. Nijmegen in midwinter was a collection point. British Second Army and American forces all crammed into the same miserable Dutch city. The mood was dark. Arnhem had failed. Everyone knew it would fail. The operation was predictable disaster from the start. Montgomery and Churchill wanted a propaganda coup, a dramatic bridge crossing, a newsreel moment. They got a massacre instead. The 6th Airborne Division dropped into an area crawling with experienced German troops, veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front. The British paratroopers didn't stand a chance. Montgomery wanted to cross the Rhine immediately after Arnhem. The Americans disagreed. They thought, correctly, that the timing was wrong, so everyone sat in Nijmegen and waited. And waited. The winter dragged on. The Ardennes offensive pulled resources away. 79th Armoured Division troops were sent to support the defence. Harvey's unit stayed in Holland, watching snow fall and wondering when the war would start moving again. They made friends in some towns, Breda, Tilburg. Hertogenbosch, Weert. In Weert, their signal officer, the son of a Welsh minister, studied Catholicism at night with a local Dutch woman. He later married her. Small human moments in the frozen waste of winter war. But those moments couldn't erase what was coming. The Reichswald. Harvey would later call it perhaps the most depressing part of the war, not the most dangerous, not the bloodiest, the most depressing. Because they weren't liberating anymore. They were invading Germany. The villages they passed through were the most deprived Harvey had ever seen. Poverty ground into the landscape, people with hollow eyes watching British tanks roll past. These weren't the cheering French civilians from Bayeux. These were people who'd lost everything. Some were Nazis, many weren't. All were starving. The weather remained atrocious. East of the Maas River, the 31st Armoured Brigade pushed toward Geilenkirchen with support from 79th Armoured Division. On November 20th, a troop of AVREs destroyed 5 pillboxes in the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortification. The official records note this as worthy of historical mention. Harvey's 16 Assault Squadron launched the first Skid Bailey Bridge over a crater in the main road to Heinsberg. Technical achievements, engineering victories. But Harvey wasn't there for the glory moments. He was there for the aftermath. One night, his Churchill tank got bogged down in mud. By morning, the mud had frozen solid. The flat bottom of the Churchill created a perfect bond with the ice. It took all day to free it, an entire day. Dozens of men. Massive effort to free one tank from frozen mud. This was the reality of the Reichswald. Teenage soldiers fighting ice while Germany collapsed around them. On February the 5th, 1945, 1,000 Allied guns started a barrage. 5 hours of continuous shelling. The opening act for crossing the Rhine. Harvey's unit supported the 51st Highland Division. They laid 2 bridges, dropped fascines, huge bundles of wood to create crossings, used their petard mortars to destroy a pillbox. One bridge failed immediately. The ground was too soft. 2 AVREs broke their tracks in the mud. One lost its fascine. Another lost its bridge. The mud was everywhere. In the flooded sections, the Canadians relied entirely on buffaloes. The amphibious vehicles churned through water that would have drowned conventional armour. Without the buffaloes, the advance would have been impossible. With them, it was merely brutal. Goch fell. Cleve fell. The crocodile flame-throwing tanks burned German positions, controlled fire used as a weapon of terror. Harvey watched from his AVRE, maintaining radio contact, coordinating movements. He'd learned to retreat into the technical details, bridge specifications, track tension, radio frequencies, fuel consumption rates. Numbers kept you sane. Numbers didn't have faces. Numbers didn't remind you of the 2 young Germans in the half-track, their heads rolling with each bump. The advance through Westphalia continued. Town after town, village after village. Some resisted, some surrendered. All looked the same after a while. Grey, cold, defeated. Harvey had joined the war expecting to fight evil. He'd seen the propaganda. Hitler's face on every poster. The promise that defeating Germany meant saving the world. And maybe it did. But the people in these villages didn't look evil. They looked hungry. They looked tired. They looked like people who'd been lied to by their government and were now paying the price. This wasn't in the propaganda. The moral complexity, the realization that civilians on both sides were just trying to survive. Spring finally arrived. The tanks pushed toward the Baltic ports. Major confrontations erupted. Harvey's unit supported various operations, laying bridges, clearing obstacles, destroying fortifications. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. But before the celebration, before VE Day, before the newsreel cameras and the victory parades, Harvey's unit reached a place in northern Germany, a camp. When they arrived, 10,000 bodies lay unburied. The smell reached them before they saw the gates. Bergen-Belsen, And everything Harvey thought he understood about the war, about why they'd been fighting, about what they'd been fighting against, suddenly became real in a way no propaganda poster could capture. The smell reached them first, before they saw the gates, before they saw the buildings, before they understood what they were looking at, the smell of death on an industrial scale. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. April 1945. Harvey Smith, 19 years old now, walked through the gates as part of the Liberation Force. British tanks had arrived days earlier. The SS guards had fled. What remained was beyond comprehension. Historical records document the facts. 10,000 bodies lay unburied throughout the camp. Another 13,000 prisoners would die in the following days, despite medical intervention. The numbers don't capture it. Numbers never do. Harvey was assigned to help with the aftermath. His job: encourage prisoners who'd wandered outside the camp perimeter to return for registration and medical care. Simple task, impossible task. He found a group in the bushes beyond the fence, maybe 5 or 6 people, former prisoners, freed but not free. Harvey tried to speak to them, tried to explain they needed to come back for help. They didn't respond. They just sat there, expressionless. Eyes that looked at him but didn't see him. Faces that had witnessed things Harvey's 19-year-old mind couldn't process. Bodies that had survived but souls that hadn't. Harvey reached into his map pocket. He had sweets, cigarettes, the small luxuries soldiers carried. He gave them everything he had. They took them without speaking, without changing expression. Then Harvey walked away because there was nothing else he could do. This was liberation. Not the propaganda version. Not the newsreel footage of grateful civilians throwing flowers. Not the triumphant music and waving flags. This, people who couldn't move, who couldn't speak, who'd been so thoroughly broken by systematic cruelty that even freedom felt meaningless. Harvey's unit participated in one symbolic act. They burned down the gallows in the camp. The wooden structure where the SS had executed prisoners for entertainment. They soaked it in fuel. They set it alight. Harvey watched it burn. The propaganda had told him he was fighting evil. Standing in Belsen, watching those gallows burn, he understood that the propaganda, for once, had told the truth. Just not the whole truth, because the propaganda had made evil seem simple. A moustache-twirling villain you could defeat with tanks and bombs. The propaganda hadn't prepared him for the scale, the systematic nature, the bureaucratic efficiency of it. The propaganda hadn't prepared him for the fact that thousands of people had participated in this. Normal people. People with families and jobs and hobbies. People who'd done this. And the propaganda certainly hadn't prepared him for what he felt standing there. Not triumph, but a profound exhaustion that went beyond the physical. The war moved forward. Harvey's unit continued north. They met American forces at the Elbe crossing near Lüneburg Heath, marshaled hundreds of German prisoners, young men and old men, all defeated, all grateful to surrender to the British rather than the Soviets. Spring sunshine warmed Harvey's face. Birds sang. Ironically, absurdly, the weather was beautiful. They drove through the ruins of Hamburg, a city bombed into rubble, civilians picking through the wreckage of their lives. Then onward to Lübeck on the Baltic coast. May 8th, 1945. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Harvey stood in Lübeck as news spread. Soldiers celebrated. Some cried, some got drunk, some just sat quietly, trying to process what they'd survived. Harvey felt the German shrapnel shift slightly inside his body. 3 surgeons had tried to remove it. 3 surgeries had failed. The metal fragment had settled somewhere near his groin, too deep to extract safely, too embedded to shift. It would stay there. for 47 years. In 1991, nearly half a century later, an enthusiastic radiographer would finally spot it on an X-ray. By then, it had become part of Harvey, a permanent souvenir of a moment near Falaise when he'd been carrying a mug of tea toward his tank. Some wars end when the shooting stops. Others stay inside you, literally. Harvey had joined the war at 18, excited about adventure. He'd believed the propaganda about glory and heroism. He'd been very pleased when Parliament changed the law so he could go abroad to fight. He landed on Gold Beach and watched Major Elphinstone die 90 minutes later. He slept under tanks and had his hammock torn apart as a joke. He was blown up by a mortar near Falaise and woke up next to dead German teenagers. He fought frozen mud in the Reichswald and lost. He developed trench foot and couldn't walk for a week. He watched Arnhem fail because politicians wanted a propaganda victory. He crossed into Germany and saw villages more deprived than anything he'd known in England. And then he walked through Belsen and saw people who couldn't move, who just sat there, expressionless. The propaganda posters never showed that part. They never explained that liberation sometimes means finding people so broken that freedom arrives too late to matter. They never mentioned that the shrapnel would stay inside you for 47 years, or that the memories would stay even longer. They never told you that victory feels less like triumph and more like exhausted survival. Harvey returned to England eventually, built a life, had a career, grew old, but somewhere inside him, deeper than the shrapnel, more permanent than the scars, remained those expressionless faces in the bushes outside Belsen, the ones who couldn't move, the ones he gave sweets and cigarettes to because it was the only thing he could do, the ones who taught him that some things can't be fixed. Some people can't be saved. Some wars never end. They just move inside you and stay there, quiet and permanent, like German shrapnel embedded too deep to remove. The gallows burned. The prisoners sat expressionless. The spring sunshine felt cruel, and Harvey Smith learned what the propaganda never taught, that the cost of defeating evil isn't measured in territory captured or battles won. It's measured in the things that stay inside you forever.